today, again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the third keynote of Esorics. So when selecting the keynote speakers, we wanted also to have a diversity of location, getting keynote speakers from various parts of the world. So now we started from a speaker from US, we moved to Europe, and now we go to Australia. We thought very hard to get somebody from Antarctica, I must confess, we couldn't find anyone, but unfortunately, in the future, with climate changes, we don't know. Okay, but let's go back. So we have today the keynote speaker, Yuval, from University of Adelaide in Australia. Also, we wanted to give a room and have a variety also in the academic ranks of the keynote speakers. So today we'll have Yuval and the keynote speaker of this later on that are a little bit not at the top of their academic ranking, but we selected because they've done a very important contribution. They're very brilliant, emerging stars. And so we wanted also to, get some of those people to give a keynote talk. So I'm very proud, therefore, to introduce Yuval. Now, Yuval is a senior lecturer at the School of Computer Science at the University of Adelaide. He received a PhD in computer sciences from the same university in 2014. His research focuses on the interface, on the security of the interface between software and hardware, which is an important topic today. And he works on a very important area, which is detecting and mitigating vulnerabilities, which result from discrepancies between the way programmers think about software execution and the concrete execution in modern processors. Based on what I have seen, some of those vulnerabilities are very difficult to achieve and to find, actually. Now, his talk is very intriguing because he's taking a look and saying, is offensive security research a scientific activity? And this is a very interesting question. I never thought about it myself, but sometimes it's very good to also, take a step back and look at those fundamental issues about the research we do. Now, what is even more interesting, he says that somehow at the end, he will reach a non-surprising conclusion. So in my view, the fact that the conclusions are not surprising will be a surprise itself. Okay, so so think carefully, about questions you want to ask, so then we can have a fun and interesting discussion at the end. So with this, I'll give the floor to Yuval, and again, thank you, Yuval, for being with us at this late hour in your part of the world. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Eliza, for the introduction. I'll try to share my screen now. Does it work? Yes. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming to this talk. It is a pleasure and it is an honor to speak for in Esorics and to give this keynote. I must admit that considering the previous keynotes, I feel humbled to be in the ranks, and so very much thanks for the opportunity. This talk is a bit different from what I usually does because I usually do, because I'm not talking today about new results, or at least not my new results. I will show one open problem that I really don't know what the answer, what's happening there. I will discuss one a new result, not mine, that I'm extremely excited about. But most of all, it's the question of what is the process or what happens in the type of research that I do. So I'll start. And those who know me, the problem of these times is that people don't really meet in life, and what you see is this small image at the side of the screen at best. But those who know me know that I'm an aging geek, but I've not always been like that. And many years ago, I've been young. I've still been, I was a geek, but I was young, as you can see. And like children my age, I had dreams. And many children want to be firefighters or police officers or football players or models or singers. And I wanted to be a scientist. And to be a scientist, I read about the great scientists of yore. So I read about people like Isaac Newton, Marie Curie, all the scientists I could find information about. But the one that really I I wanted to be like, really idolized, is Luigi Galvani. And the reason that I idolize Luigi Galvani is because as a child, when you read about someone that their work is basically tasing frogs, then you have to admire that. That's where we go. And what Luigi Galvani really did, it took dissected frogs and tased them. And what he saw is that when he when it passed current through the frog, the legs twitch. And of course, twitch is very topical and important in computer security today. Anyway, several years, too many years have passed, and the reality is that I'm now a senior lecturer in computer science. And senior lecturer is, for particular for the Americans, senior lecturer is Australian for a assistant professor. So as you all know, that's a junior faculty. It just looks nice when they call it senior. And assistant professor in itself is an interesting title, because assistant professor, is not a real professor. And we know that because assistant qualifies a professor, and when we qualify, it's not the real thing. The same goes for associate professor. It's not a real professor. The only real professor is unqualified. But the question that goes the same thing about computer science, that it's why do we need the science there? When we talk about physicists, we don't have science, physics science. We don't have a biological science or biological scientist. For computer science, we have computer science. So that brings the question, is computer science really a science? And to answer this question, I will try to go through a bit through what I'm doing as part of my academic research, and to see how it relates to what scientists do. So what am I doing? So I have this processor, and this processor takes a program and produces some output. And it can take another program and produce another output. And for some reason, there is a widely held belief that if you put tomato and orange into this processor, you get tomato juice and orange juice. And basically, my research could be summarized as trying to refute this belief. And how did I get to that line of research? This line of research all starts with Colin Clance submarines. For those of you following the news, you know Collins class are the current submarines that Australia has, and we have recently struck very good deal. Instead of buying submarines for $66 billion and getting them in 2032, we only pay 100 billion and get them 20 years later. And by striking, and we not only struck this beyond the full deal, but in the way we managed to anchor China and alienate France. So that's called win-win-win, directly out of the deal. But roughly, no, it's more than 5. Oh, I'm getting older. About 8 years ago, in 2013, the Australian Navy discovered that they have a problem. The problem is that these Collins-class submarines have a large number of computers. And a large number of computers mean that there is a large weight. They're just carrying these computers. And they draw a lot of energy just because they need to operate. And they hit the submarine, they discharge the batteries too fast, and they don't like that. So they looked around and they had the epiphany, hey, we can use a simple solution called virtualization. But there is a problem with this solution, and the problem is that we run tomatoes and oranges on the same computer. And the submarines, by their nature, have a lot of secret information or classified information, and we don't want to mix that. So the Defense Science Technology Group, the research arm of the Australian Armed Forces, contracted the University of Adelaide to investigate the solution. And the question that they asked me to answer is this secure? And I have done the usual things that we do when we get this question, looked at existing literature, did some experiments. And then in those experiments, I discovered something that's called transparent page sharing, which is a feature of the hypervisor, which is basically to save space. The hypervisor shares pages with identical content. So it scans the VMs, and if it finds identical pages, it shares them as a single physical page. Now, obviously, sharing as a single physical page brings a problem, because if one VM changes this page, then the change is reflected in all VMs. So the solution is to use standard solution to use what's called copy on write. And copy on write means that when one VM tries to write to the processor to the page, then the hypervisor catches that, copies the page, and gives this copy to the VM to modify, and therefore that means that the other pages do not get changed. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, that means that copying a page or writing to a shared page takes a long time, and writing to shared pages are slower. And I made what's called science hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that we can use that to detect what software runs across virtual machine boundaries. Did the experiments, it really worked, and I was really happy because I had a result to share with the defense forces. And when we wanted to publish that, we did the literature review, and it has been known for years. So we had the result. It was very good for defense. We told them, and continue from there. And while we went to, so now what we have here, is that this is a process of finding a vulnerability that we see here. And when we look at that and compare that to the work of Luigi Galvani, what we have is Luigi Galvani, what he has done is he investigated frogs, and the way that he did that is he exposed them to some external signal and watched what happens and learned about the operation of the frog this way. And basically, this process is the same process that research on microarchitectural offensive research works. So we have the researchers, and they investigate the processor, and the way that we do that is we just inject the signal and test what the results are. And in the example of the page of these pages, the transparent shared pages, the idea is very simple. We inject the page that we know might be in other VMs, and then we test whether it is the hypervisor shares it or not. So basically, following the same process as logical. Now, the thing is that this vulnerability is not very significant. And when I presented it to defense, then yes, we showed that it is not fully secure, but they asked me, is that all? And then I guess I got the idea that, hey, if we share the page, we also share the cache. And I'll now, what I'll do now, I'll introduce the first cache attack that I found. And so I'll give a bit of background. So here is an example of the computer. This is my first computer. It's an Apple IIe. This is a great computer. It was extremely fast. It could do 1 million calculations per second. Now, over the years, I've bought quite a few computers, and here is a recent one that I bought. This computer runs 20 hyperthreads, each of them at 3.7 gigahertz. So we've opened the performance gap of about 5 orders of magnitude. So performance is improved by 5 orders of magnitude. At the same time, memory access latency has also improved. My Apple IIe can access, can do 2 accesses per microseconds, or the latency is 500 nanoseconds. And modern processors are 10 times faster, which is nice, but it means that we have opened the gap of 4 orders of magnitude between processor speed and the memory speed. And what that means is that when our processor asks for data, it takes time for this data to come to the processor. And because programs show locality, then getting this data again takes again a long time. So to bridge this gap, processor designers put a small bank of memory, which being smaller and being different technology and being closer to the processor means that it is much faster. And we call that the cache. And the basic idea is that when data goes through the cache, it's stored for the next time. And because of locality, we can access data much faster. But this introduces a question of consistency. In some cases, the context of the cache can be different from the context of memory. And that means that access gives us data that is not in the memory. So to allow us to fix that, Intel gave us an ability to flush data from the cache. And that means that the next time we get the data from memory, it's a bit slow, but we get fresh data. So now with that, remember that we have 2 virtual machines and they share a page, and because they share a page, they share a cache. So we can now have an attacker and the victim that have a line in memory that they share. And what the attacker can do is flush this line from memory, wait a bit, and then measure how long it takes to get this data from memory again. Now, if while the attacker waits, the victim has not done anything, then it will take a long time. If, on the other hand, the attacker flushes the line from memory, and while it waits, the victim accesses the memory, the line will be in the cache, and then access will be fast. And then we repeat this attack, and we can get a trace of how when the victim accesses the memory line. And the example that we usually give is doing modular exponentiation, for example, as in RSA. This has a sequence of square and multiply operations. And when when it processes the exponent bit, if the bit is 0, then we have a square without a multiply. If we have a bit 1, then we have a square and followed by multiply. And we show this example of a trace, and we can see here that we have a square followed by a multiply, so the bit is 1, and another square multiply bit is 1, and we can see how that clicks the secret. But it turns out that that we lie a bit in this example. And to show the lie, I'll go to a different, to a similar example without the signal. So here we have a trace of 3 memory lines, and we see the memory, we see them without a victim, so there is no victim. The vertical lines that we see here is a noise that we get from throughout the process. And what we see here is it's basically lines staying at around 300, 350 cycles. But we lie here because one of the things that I've done before pre-processing is remove values that are above these 300. And when we look at the real trace, we see a lot of noise above the 300 marks, 350 mark. And if we zoom out just to look at this noise, we start seeing some pattern here. And I call this pattern the flash reload pulsar. So if we see it even better if we look in a single line, this is just a single line out of the previous graph. What we see is that there is some pattern of accesses that take longer than usual. And not only they take longer than usual, they happen at quite regular intervals. And the time that it takes keeps increasing until it drops back. So so this is, from the attack perspective, this is just noise. But as Daniel Gross says, there is in computers, in processors, we don't have noise, or what we have is other people's data. So this is an extremely interesting phenomenon because it is clear that we see that there is something. It is clear that we have something that generates this pattern, but I don't have an explanation for this signal. I don't know what causes this. And over the years, I looked at it sporadically. Last time was yesterday when I prepared this slide. And I'm trying to come up with an explanation that says what we really see here. And I don't know. I know that the time interval between these peaks is, this is something that happened 9,000 times per second. 9,000 times per second is a weird number. It's nothing with the operating system. It's nothing that I can think of in the hardware. So there is something there. I have no idea what it is. Unfortunately, as a senior lecturer, I cannot investigate, or I need to prioritize my research, so I never got to really solve this. And the thing is that we have a question here. We have something in the processor that we don't understand. Now, my gut feeling is that this does not affect security. For example, I know that if there is a cache access, then these delays do not happen. So we cannot use them to distinguish between access, something in the accesses. But when prioritizing things, because I work in security, I'm trying to find the things that are more relevant. All the time I had, since discovering this, probably around 2017, I always had things that are more important. But the fact that I think that this is not important does not mean that it really is, because we really do want to understand how this processor works. And I can give a counterexample. So there is the question of replacement algorithms and in the cache. So when we put new data in the cache, we need to evict some old data, and the processor has some policy to decide how it works. And where this becomes relevant is there's another attack, the prime probe attack, which is much older. This is an attack from, I think that it was first published on clay tablets in the early 21st century. The idea with the prime probe attack is that the cache is divided into sets, and the spy accesses memory to fill a cache set. It lets the victim run. The victim accesses some locations in the memory, and then the attacker measures the time to access the data, the data that it previously put in the cache. And if the victim has not accessed, as displayed here, then this access will be fast. If the victim accesses the location in the same cache set, access will be slow. And when you run the attack on the last level cache, there are three main challenges. The first challenge is to find an eviction set. We need to find a sequence of addresses, or a group of, or set of addresses that all go to the same cache set. And this is hard because we don't have full information on how memory or virtual addresses map to the cache set. The other thing is that we have somewhat slow temporal resolution. In the experiments that I have done, I couldn't get a good signal at below 3,000 cycles per probe, and 3,000 cycles is around a microsecond, so we can get about a megabit per second. And the last thing is that we have some remnants effect that when we do the probe, we get, when the victim accesses, we get that the victim accesses. But in the following probes, we still have for some following probes, we still see that it behaves like the victim has access. And again, this is something that we've known for quite a few years. And the explanation for that always was that it is because the replacement algorithm is not a real least recently used. There is a pseudo algorithm, pseudo LRU algorithm, and it fails to completely evict the victim from the cache. So investigating the replacement algorithm and finding what it is was interesting. But again, I never got to it. I thought about it. I wanted to do it. I want to improve the behavior of prime probe, but I couldn't see a real security impact for that. And it turns out that in that case, I was wrong. So if we look, there have been at least 2 papers in 2020, Priongos and others in the Usenix Security 2020 showed side channel using the LRU replacement algorithm. And later, Pepe Villa and others showed algorithm for finding the replacement algorithm, the replacement policy. And these are solid works. They showed I guess that the result was as expected. So we have a result there. It is interesting. And then a week ago, I was extremely surprised and excited by one of the brilliant works of 2021, and that's the work on the prime scope for null to run in Verbavede. What they showed is that they tied the replacement algorithm, the replacement policy in the L1 cache, in the L3 cache, and the inclusive property of the cache, and they managed to solve all 3 problems. So they managed to do an eviction set at 600 times faster than we knew was possible. They reduced the temporal resolution, so they can, we now go at around 70 cycles, and the remnants effect does not exist there. So it's a brilliant work, and I really recommend that everyone reads it, or at least anyone interested in side channels. And that shows that even though for someone who works in this field, we don't understand the full design of the processor. And moreover, even when we start to understand that, we don't really understand the interactions between the parts there. And when we look at the processor, this is designed by an example of how a processor is designed, we have a large number of parts, and so far we have investigated those, and we sort of understand. I believe that we sort of understand how the L1 cache works, and there have been some works that show that the translation look aside buffer. And recent work so some understanding of the front end, but overall, this whole structure is mostly opaque. We don't really know how it works. And this is important for us to learn how it works, or to understand it, not only because it would help the Australian submarines. It actually wouldn't help much. By the time we get these submarines, their main use would be to shuttle people to their homes, at least if our climate action continues to be the way it is. But this is important because these processors are what drives the current society. So we build upon this, and all the security that we claim to have in our system is based upon the security of these processors. So if anything is not secure here, then it affects the whole system, the security of the system. That makes it quite an important research area, at least in my opinion. And because we don't know, because we've only scratched the surface, I think that this is a good area to get into, because there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit. Pulsar is the flash reload pulsar is an example, something that needs to be done at some stage. So going back to Galvani, looking a bit from higher perspective, we have these processors. We investigate them in similar ways to the way that Galvani investigated frogs, or similar way to the way that biologists now investigate or research any other animal, or to the way that physicists research pulsars. We try to excite with, put some signal in, we check what we get in the result. But there is a fundamental difference, because while for frogs, we believe that they were evolved through natural selection, with processors, we know that this is not the case. We know that someone designed these processors, and so again, that raises the question whether this research is science, or maybe it is intelligent design. And we even have our holy books for our research. And I guess that I was wondering for a long time what the answer for that, whether this is really science or not, and how do we think how do we need to think about that? And the best that I can say is that science is oblivious to the question, or it's not. It is independent of the question of whether things were created or not. We investigate things the way that the world as we see it, as we observe it, and it doesn't matter. And the fact that these processors were designed doesn't change the nature of science. And in the fact that even if Intel has access, Intel knows obviously everything that there is in these processors, but like software, they are so complex that it is impossible to actually reason about them completely. And therefore, just the question of complexity makes this research and point. It's something that we are that is the same, or makes this a science. So in summary, sum up, we had in this talk, we had Marie Curie and Luigi Galvani, pulsars, submarines, and frogs. And personally, I don't see how this could be any more scientific than that. So thank you everyone for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, okay, thanks for the very interesting talk, which really shows how we have a long way to go to better understand those vulnerabilities. But I have a few questions, but let's start with the audience. So, is there any question? Okay, if there are no questions, I have a first comment, okay? So in a way, I see that in some of our research that we do in general, is more an engineering type of research that we do. It's not really basic research like physics, okay? And when it comes to vulnerabilities, what really, especially companies require, they would like to have a systematic methodologies to find those vulnerabilities. So we have experience in analyzing the cellular network protocols, and companies liked our work because at least we had a more systematic process. Because at the end of the day, if finding a vulnerability is really an art more than a scientific process, means that, yeah, researchers can find one problem, but then, that's it. And what we need to have is a very systematic approach. And so that's my comment. So I'd like to see whether in your area, because side channels are particularly complicated, we deal more with logical vulnerabilities in our research, not with side channel attacks. Whether one could hope to have a more systematic process or guidelines that people can really apply to find, at least more vulnerabilities. Not all, but at least, you can find, let's say, even what can say, I can provide you certain assurance against a certain side channel. Something like this would be really critical in my
view. Well, so there are two, I guess, from my perspective, there are two answers to this. Okay. First, we are a very young researcher. So when I talked about the clay tablets, that's less than 20 years ago. So as a young research area, we first need to find out what is there. And if we look at other vulnerabilities, for example, buffer overflows that were the main research area, a significant research area in the 90s, after the internet warm. And the beginning, finding a vulnerability like that, or finding a class, or identifying a class of buffer overflows was considered research, was considered a research result. And as the domain matured, we want to find more than that. So domain matured, we started getting the attacks that are much more complicated to publish, like return-oriented programming. And just finding a bug in software was not considered a publishable result. And in a sense, I think that it also arrived in side channels. So it's hard to see if we take, for example, there has been very little research on L2 attacks, at least on Intel processors. And I could hazard a guess on why this is the case, because I don't see an advantage, or what would be the advantage of such attacks. They will get the same spatial resolution as L1 attacks. They will be slightly slower than L1 attacks. So what's the benefit? The other side, we do start to see systematic approaches. So the Canella and others systematize the transient execution attacks. And the VUSEC group at Amsterdam developed systematic methods of searching for side channels, and there are others that have done that. So we are starting to see these systematic approaches to finding vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So are there questions from the audience? Don't be shy, because otherwise, I can ask more questions to follow up. Okay, let's wait then. Okay, yeah. Oh, thank you. This is interesting to see that there are more systematic approaches to find them. But in terms, but you made a point that to say, there is no advantage in doing research on the vulnerability of L2 caches, because those are similar to the one for L3, right? But what do you mean? I mean, even exactly showing and say, look, we tried, but basically the attacks are the same is a very important point. Sometimes people worry too much about what can I publish, and people say, I don't waste my time because I know this paper won't be published. Now, to be honest, the scientists that you mentioned, they were not worried about this, I guess, in ancient times. So I feel that this is sometimes really kind of drives research or engineering effort or approaches to systematize in some kind of bad direction, because at the end of the day, negative results are important. Now, this is a different thing. There is a discussions on the issues that conferences have, especially sometimes being too selective, they reject good papers. But fortunately, also today, we have public archives, and very important results sometimes are in those papers, in those public archives. Okay. So I understand that for you to do a career, you needed to have the papers in the conferences. But still, I think it's very important to even say, these ideas that certain, again, certain components have similar attacks than other components, because in practice, this can be very useful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a problem with modern science or modern academia, that we get papers accepted based on, in part, a beauty contest. It's that we accept paper based on the impact, and at least in security, the impact is significant, and we accept much fewer papers than are solid scientific work in every conference, I think. So we have to reject papers that are solid work, and generally solid work, but they don't pass the beauty contest. And I take part on the blame for that. I'm reviewing papers and reviewing conferences, and they do the same. But I wish there was the ability to do that, and I hope that in some stage I will be, as I call it, unqualified professor, and at that stage I can do whatever I want, not get publications published, and I hope to do more interesting stuff then. Oh, other interesting stuff. I think that what I'm doing is extremely interesting. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
But we do see those. So recently, what's his
Oh,
name?
Yuval, sorry to interrupt you because there is a very good question on the chat by somebody very senior in our field. Joachim, perhaps you can read the question.
Yes. How would you comment on the following difference?
So to everyone, read the chat, okay?
Yes. This is thank you, Joachim, for the question. It's an excellent question. And yes, so there is a big difference, and I think it's related to what I said, that the intelligent design. So we really have a ground truth in chips. If Intel wanted, they could tell us what works and what doesn't work. But there are several. There are two things with that. The first is Intel doesn't tell us, so we, from our perspective, from anyone outside Intel, it's just the same as investigating frogs. We don't have the ground truth. We can just speculate. And the other thing is what I said about the complexity. Intel had all the information it needed. Intel knows how speculative execution works on the processor. And Intel was aware of side channels for at least since at least 2005. But the relationship, the complexities of things drove of relations go at least quadratically with a number of elements, and being able to reason about everything that happens in the processor is simply impossible. It's not only in processor. We look at any big software, whether it be a Microsoft Word or Google Chromium. They have bugs in there, and these are companies that invest a lot of effort in making sure that the software works without bugs. And still, just last week we had a zero-day bug in Apache. So it's just the complexity. The fact that we have the specification that we can verify against the ground truth, it helps, or it can help, but it does not solve the problem because the vulnerabilities are complex. They combine multiple elements that interact together, and once we get enough layers of instructions, then we start missing some of the interactions.
Yeah. Are there other questions, comment? So yeah, there is another question from Ahmed. So he has the following question regarding implementation of cache levels. They are, they are mainly vendor specific, and does it affect the approaches to find the vulnerabilities?
Yes. So the answer is definitely it does affect. So we know that, for example, that flash reload, at least across cores, doesn't work on AMD processors. And there are other research that showed features of ARM cache, ARM last level cache that prevent attacks even when the cache is inclusive. So auto-lock feature. So we need to do the research is vendor specific. It's sometimes not even not only vendor specific. It's processor generation specific, or even firmware version specific. The importance of that is, but still, whenever we do that, we get some information about a higher level implications. So or what things work, what things do not work, how interactions, what we should protect against in future generations of the processor. So the research to find vulnerabilities depends on the specifics of the processor. Yes.
That's great. Other questions? Yeah, then if there are no questions, I have just a comment, and perhaps Yuval can follow up. So you say that you made a very important point, which is more career related. You say, I really look forward. I don't know whether when I will be an unqualified professor, so I can do really what I want. And I think this is really nice. Is a very good message for younger generation. Okay, so you have to publish, but perhaps sooner or later you will have time to work on what you really like. But of course, I must also tell you, yeah, you will be really. You can say, I can do whatever you want. I don't, publishing, I mean, now, but still you will have your own students who have to publish. So yeah. You cannot escape completely, okay? But I think, being older like I am, it gives you an opportunity to really be less concerned, and perhaps one can build a nice research portfolio where you will have some room, to do really what you are interested, and some other, and then the other things will be the mainstream and so forth. But based on my experience, I remember I had a paper which I published 2004, so it was a long time ago. Just joined the Purdue, and now this paper is receiving today a lot of citations. At that time, I couldn't send this paper to CCS or some of those conferences. Would be rejected without pity, but now it's receiving a lot of citation. So at the end, my view is that the important thing is the impact of the work, and the good work gets noticed. And one advantage we have with the internet that you can make your work known. Okay?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, for conferences, I would really look back and say how many papers that are published in the top really make an impact, are known, people have a certain impact. Okay, either as a larger number of citations, but adoptions by industry. There is the test of time awards. But sometimes it would be very interesting and say a paper which was rejected. So authors should say this paper was rejected. I can show you 10 years after that this paper became very important. That would be nice to do. So we can say that, being rejected from a conference doesn't mean that the work is bad. One has to be very confident. This is very important for younger research, and also for the senior ones, by the way. So, Yuval, I don't know if you have any advice to give to junior researchers, based on your experience, and then we can close the session here.
Advice. It's hard to give advice. I don't feel that I have enough experience, and with publishing, yes, paper get rejected. If you believe in them, they will find a good home. And as you said, sometimes we see works that were not appreciated at first, and then gain importance, which is really interesting to see when it happens. But
yeah,
and it does. So I guess it's a random process. Conferences are a random process. Some papers are 100% accept. Some papers are 100% reject. But most of the papers, it just depends on who your reviewers are. and get rejected, it's probably a good time to drink something and the next day start working on submitting again.
Okay, I think that's good. Is there any other comments, question for you, Al? I'm sure you can contact him via email if you have anything you want to. Now, just a quick reminder before we leave the session. There is now the parallel sessions with the many important areas: encryption, machine learning, network security, privacy. And don't forget, we have the Best Paper Award session at 4:45 Central European time. So I hope that you will be attending the events. We still have other session, and then we have the keynote talk. This time we will go back to North America, we'll be in Canada, and talking about this machine learning, how we can trust machine learning. And finally, the plenary with some important announcement about next year conference. So thank you, and a special thank you to Yuval for this very nice enlightening talk, which really touched the many important aspects related to our research, what is a science and what means a science for the research we do. Okay. Oh, I can see Aya is online. Aya, do you have anything you want to add?
I wanted to thank Yuval also from my side. Thank you very much, Yuval, for your keynote. The topic is extremely interesting, and thanks for supporting us at Azorix with your keynote.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, so I think we can close the session. We are 2 minutes early. We are not so precise as the Germans are. I'm joking, but that's okay. We kind of are a bit earlier, but we can close the session now, right, Ian?
Yeah, right. So yeah, the next we have after the break, we have Best Paper Awards.
Yeah.
And in the program, then we have technical sessions again, and social activity including plenary. Okay, so we look forward to seeing you all, and thanks again, Yuval, and see you at the next session.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Now.